And we're going. Okay, so today we're finally going to get to the Descartes reading. We're moving on from Plato. But probably about half of this lecture, half of class today, we're going to talk a bit about the scientific revolution. If you were able to watch the last lecture, the one that I recorded on Tuesday, I posted it, I think, pretty much right after I recorded it. So it's been up since like Tuesday evening. But if you were able to watch that lecture, we wrapped up Plato, and we talked a little bit about Aristotle. We talked a little bit about medieval philosophy, and we talked a little bit about modern philosophy. Descartes, he's considered the father of modern philosophy, and so we're going to talk more about modern philosophy, get a little bit more details about that. But we also need to talk about, before we even get to Descartes, we're going to have to talk about some of the basics when it comes to the scientific revolution. I'm not going to get into all the details, but we're going to get some of the highlights of what happened, how things changed about our view of the universe, once the scientific revolution starts to get rolling, because this will give us a better understanding of Descartes. This will help us better understand the Descartes reading. So that's the agenda today. But let's see. I've got a private message here, but the question really applies generally to the class. Somebody's asking if it's too late to turn in their essay. No, just get it in as soon as possible. I haven't even had a chance to look at any of them. I've got one more assignment to grade for my Lone Star class it ends today, or actually it ended yesterday. It ended last night. They turned in their final. It was an 8-week, like a shorter class online. I've got to do that first, and then tomorrow morning I'm probably going to get started grading some of the papers that have already been turned in. But I've told a few students, look, as long as you get it in by the end of the week. I was saying that under the assumption that next week was spring break, but it isn't, I guess, now. It is at UH. I don't know why, but I swear UH has a spring break, or UH downtown. I don't know about the main campus, but I'm not teaching at the main campus this semester. But anyways, yeah, I figure a lot of people are having issues, busted pipes, the freeze, put a lot of people in some pretty tough situations. I'm getting tons of emails with all sorts of stories. So, yeah, it's all good. Turn it in as soon as you can. I'm not going to have a chance to probably finish grading them all till early next week or late this week. So, okay, so back to the issue at hand, and trying to set things up for the first meditation, Descartes' first meditation, the reading that I've been pretty antsy to get to. Last lecture we went over this. I'm not going to go over the classical, the medieval period. We'll keep it, focused on the modern. But remember, there's a big focus. I said in the last lecture, if you were able to watch it, I said towards the end of the last lecture that one of the things that you could argue characterizes the modern period is this shift in focus away from metaphysics that had been kind of the focus of the classical era, people like Plato and Aristotle. The focus shifts away from metaphysics and towards epistemology. Okay, so towards theories of knowledge. How do you know what you know? What is the basis for knowing things? How do you justify? What sort of criteria? So when we get to the reading today, you'll see this right off the bat. The full title of the essay is Meditations on First Philosophy. Some people will just refer to this essay as Descartes' Meditations, but the full title is Meditations on First Philosophy. And in the end, the sort of big picture is, what is first philosophy? For Descartes, first philosophy now that he's writing this in the modern period, is epistemology. That's what we have to start with. We have to start with a robust, accurate, reliable theory of knowledge before we can come up with any other theories about the natural world, about physics, anything that we can know. So this is the shift of focus. To understand why there's this shift in focus, I think it's a bit instructive to talk about the scientific revolution. And we're also going to talk about some other things too, besides the scientific revolution, that were happening during the same time period, around the time Descartes is writing. You know, Descartes dies in 1650. So we're talking like the late 1500s, early 1600s. What kind of things were going on in Western Europe, in the European world? You know, where all this sort of philosophy has its roots, or continue, the sort of the tradition continues sort of from the Greeks, you know, through to this period. So what is it really that makes this shift happen? Again, an understanding, I think, of the scientific revolution, and some other things we'll talk about in a minute, will give us a better grasp of why Descartes, particularly Descartes, he's sort of famous for this, but modern philosophy in general makes this move. You know, why is the focus on knowledge, not on, you know, theories of, you know, the nature of forms and higher realms of forms like Plato, or, you know, talking about final aims like Aristotle, all that stuff we covered in the last lecture. So, in fact, I need to correct some of this. Let me, I think I can just fix it real quick without too much change here. Okay. So, I've got three names. I've got three names up here on my PowerPoint. And, you know, if we were taking a whole semester studying like the history of the Copernican or the scientific revolution, whatever you want to call it, we would cover a lot more than these three men. But for our purposes, these guys will do, to kind of understand some of the main shifts in our understanding of the universe that occurred during this time period, during the 16th century, in Europe. Now, I'm guessing that most of you, if not all of you, probably have heard of Galileo. There might be some of you who know Copernicus, maybe even Kepler. I don't know, but I find that most of my students have never heard of any of these people, or if they have, it's just Galileo, and they don't know a whole lot about him. Sorry. Ignore those sirens. And wait for them to pass. Busy neighborhood I live in. Okay, did anybody tell me about something about the scientific revolution? What do you know about the scientific revolution, or as it's sometimes referred to the Copernican revolution? What were some of the insights? What were some of the things that changed about our conception of the universe? Yeah, what are some things that we believed back before the scientific revolution that we no longer believe? Yeah, Dylan, what were you gonna?
I know it was a drastic change in the way we seen things. You know, it was that why is why. You know, if you can't see it, it must not be real. I'm assuming that it's very similar to the Age of Enlightenment.
Right. Well, yeah, it leads to the Enlightenment philosophers. Yeah, definitely. There's a guy named Kant who we'll probably talk about him a little bit when we get to the end of Descartes. We talk about some of these other philosophers. But yeah, this leads to the Age of Enlightenment, and I think you're right to talk about, you know, if you can't see it, you know, that's not actually true of all these guys. You're going to see when we get to Descartes. That's not completely true, but I see why you would say that, because they're developing a new scientific method, and they're part of this. And a part of that is using observations to test things, and not relying on things like Plato did, you know, these forms which are not, you know, non-tangible. So yeah, you're right. There was a more experimental approach to science, where people were actually, you know, using observations to try to discover truth about nature, where they weren't Aristotle, you know, he was a bit of an observationist, but even he sort of was guided by sort of some underlying metaphysics. He sort of presupposed a framework, and you could argue that his observations were guided by that framework. Whereas these philosophers, at least some of them, a lot of them, they want to develop a science that is sort of develop the theory on the observation. Don't come there with a theory already in place and then impose it on what you see. So I think your response is completely, it's definitely valid. But what are like some actual so like scientific truths about the universe, let's say, or the physics or anything? You know, like what are some of the things that like these scientists decided were no longer true and sort of fought for? How about like what do they think about where Earth was located in relationship to all the other planets and the sun and all that? What did people believe before the scientific revolution? Where was Earth in the solar system? Did they know that Earth was the third planet from the sun, or what did they think before all this stuff? Nobody knows? Y'all don't know any of these? Wow, man. Um, that's shocking. So they thought that Earth was in the middle of the universe. They thought that Earth was in the center of everything. So everything that exists, um, you know, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars. They thought everything up there in the night sky uh, was surrounding Earth, and Earth was in the center of it all. And so this was something that was believed going way back to the Greeks. You could probably find other ancient cultures that had similar beliefs. But we're talking about the West. You know, this goes back far, and Aristotle. You know, Aristotle even argues for this position in his physics and in his metaphysics. And not only was Earth seen as the center of everything, of all creation, but it was also believed that all the planets were moving in perfect circles. The sun and the planets, the moon, all of these objects were moving in perfect circles around the Earth. And they were always moving at a constant speed, never changing their speed. They wouldn't go faster or slower or speed up or slow down or anything. So, and there were all these other assumptions too, mainly based on some of the arguments that you find in Aristotle. You know, he thought that the planets were somehow divine. If they weren't gods, they were at least godlike or divine-like. And so therefore they must be perfect in a divine sense. And he thought that a circle or a sphere was the perfect shape. There was something about that shape, that geometrical shape, that was perfect. So these divine beings must be perfectly smooth orbs, and they must be moving in perfect circles, because again, circles are perfect. It's the most perfect shape. And they must be moving at the same speed, a constant speed. Because if if they're godlike, if they're divine, or they actually are gods, why would they change their speed? If you're perfect, you don't go faster or slower, you stay in the same rate of speed. So these were some of the assumptions that went all the way back to the ancient Greeks. They all, and all these medieval philosophers, through medieval Europe, even with the rise of Christianity, with the rise of Christianity and the dominance of Christianity, even like the really intelligent, scholarly Christians who were studying astronomy, they were trying to understand what they thought of as God's universe and God's creation. they bought into these arguments from Aristotle. They thought that, yeah, of course, like, we don't believe in the Greek gods, but, God is just and God is reasonable and God's rational, and this just makes sense. And so, sure, this is how God designed the universe. It's Earth's in the middle, we're the most important, all these other objects, they're, God's clock, in a sense. They all the seasons and all this stuff has a reason behind it. And so they held on to many of these assumptions. It's not until we get to people like Copernicus, and Copernicus is the first who we know of, in the West, in Europe, to propose, what we call the heliocentric model. Anybody know what heliocentric means? Heliocentric. No one knows what that means? I'm just being shy. Well, it's the model that we now follow today. Earth's not in the center of the universe. It's not in the center really of anything. The sun is in the center of our solar system. But Copernicus, again, he's the first one to propose a theory like this. What if Earth's not in the middle? What if the sun is in the middle? What if we devise a heliocentric model of the universe? There were some problems with, you can imagine, there were some problems with Aristotle's model. And some scholars had devised ways around these problems, and the model had gotten more and more complex. They didn't give up these assumptions. All the stuff I mentioned, they wouldn't give up that Earth's in the middle. Let's keep that E up there. Let me write the E. Right? They wouldn't give up Earth being in the middle. They wouldn't give up the planets being perfect circles, moving at a perfectly, constant speed. Wouldn't give that one up. Wouldn't give up the circular orbits around the Earth. But there was a man named Ptolemy, and his innovation. He kept assuming all this stuff, but he helped devise what was called the Ptolemaic model. This was the model that eventually gets replaced once we get to the scientific revolution. And the Ptolemaic model, again, it assumes all the stuff Aristotle did, but it adds this innovation of what were called epicycles. So anytime a planet, let's say that this circle right here is a little planet, and we're going to assume that it's orbiting the Earth. It's going around the Earth. Every time it goes around the Earth once, that's an orbit. And so the Ptolemaic model assumed, well, maybe there's orbits within orbits, because this model that we started with doesn't really quite work. If you're assuming all this stuff that Aristotle's assuming, and you're trying to predict things about the night sky, you might go out one night and look up at the sky and you see this planet right here. Let's just say it's Mars or something. And you go out and you figure out where it's at, and you take a measurement, you mark your little book where it's at. And then you wait a night, and you go the next night, and you look at the night sky, and the planet has moved to that point. So you take a measurement, you're like, okay, well, in one night it moved 3 clicks, or whatever you measure by. In one night it moves 3 clicks. So in 30 nights it'll move 90 clicks. And so you take that measurement and you predict that in 90 days this planet will be over here. Let me move it all the way over here. And so you wait patiently. Your 30 days or 9 days, whatever I said. You go out to the night sky. You go outside at night. You look up at the sky, and you expect the planet is going to be right there, but it's all the way up here or something. You're like, whoa, that was way off. That doesn't make any sense. This system kind of doesn't work. So Ptolemy thought, well, again, maybe there's cycles within cycles. Maybe there's an epicycle. So instead of, looping around the Earth in this perfect circle the whole time, every once in a while, maybe the planet goes off course. They still move in a circle, perfect circle, but they do a little loop-de-loop, right? So maybe this planet moves for a few days and comes off its course and does a little loop and then loops back on and keeps going. And then after a few more days, it does another loop. And then it comes back to the original course, and so on and so forth. And each of the planets has, a certain amount of epicycles and whatever. And if you look at the Ptolemaic model, it gets a little bit more accurate to predict things, but it becomes more and more complex as inconsistencies arise. They have to add more cycles and cycles within cycles, cycles within cycles. It just gets so confusing. But when Copernicus comes along and says, well, what if the Earth is not the center? What if the Earth is actually moving? And this helps to revolutionize things. But this is still not a very good model. This is still not a perfect model. We're getting closer to the Copernican model. Let me write that here, Copernican model. We're getting closer to that, but we're still a ways off, right? We got the sun in the middle. That's a good step. That's a step in the right direction. Anybody else want to jump in and correct some of the other problems? What else is the problem? We got the Earth out of the middle. Now the sun's in the middle. We're making progress. What else is wrong? Do the planets move in perfect circles around the sun? No, they don't. They don't. What is their path shaped like? Nobody knows this? I'll try to approximate it here. Something like that. Obviously a little bit different, but something more like an oval, an elliptical orbit, as Kepler said. So Kepler, he's the second person on the list here. I feel like this font is too small. Let me make it a bit bigger here. So one of Kepler's big innovations was this idea of elliptical orbits. Maybe the planets don't move in perfect circles. And to me, and that's what he's most famous for, but to me the more impressive insight that Kepler had was that he had a different view of gravity than Aristotle. And that allowed him to also postulate that not only did the planets move in ovals and maybe not circles, but that their rate of speed changed. They weren't always moving at a constant speed. See, Aristotle thought, again, Earth's in the center. And so for him, gravity could be explained because of Earth's location. If Earth's in the center, things fall. Gravity is the thing. Heavy things fall because they're moving to the center. Earth, water falls to the center of all that is the Earth, right? Earth's in the middle. Air and fire are light. They don't weigh anything for Aristotle. So they move up. They rise. They move out to the edges of the universe. But Kepler, and this is something that also Galileo tried to prove. I don't know if you ever learned this in your science class, or maybe you did and forgot. But Galileo tried to prove this with his experiment by dropping a feather and an apple from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and to try to demonstrate that even though the apple is heavier, it really should fall at the same speed. because he was with Kepler. He thought that gravity was not explained by Earth being in the middle, things just fall to the middle. He thought that all objects have a gravitational pull or force that they exert, and they repel and attract and all this. So he thought that planets would change their speed when they got further away from the sun, and they would, get a little slower when they got closer to the sun because of the force of gravity of the planets on each other and the sun on the planets, etc. And he actually Kepler was smart enough to figure out how to calculate the velocity or the speed. I can't remember. It's been a while since I actually took a long time ago in community college. I took a class in astronomy, and we actually learned Kepler's law. And Kepler's law, it's a formula for actually calculating. If you know the location of the planet in its orbit, where it's at in relation to the sun, you can know its speed or its velocity if using Kepler's formula. So I think the guy was smart, and again, his big innovation was the elliptical orbits, and also this new conception of gravity that was eventually going to overthrow the Aristotelian view, the view of Aristotle that had dominated science for centuries. What about Galileo, though? Anybody want to throw in anything about Galileo? What's he known for? No one's familiar with the old Galileo, Galilee, not Galilee. Where's he from? He's Italian. I used to know this. Galileo.
Only like the father of modern physics.
Modern physics. Well, no, but
well, not modern, but
he laid the groundwork. I think you could say. For most people give Sir Isaac Newton, credit for modern physics or whatnot. But if it wasn't for Galileo, there wouldn't be a Newton for sure. I think some people call him the father of the scientific method. That might be what you're thinking about.
That's what it was.
He's the father of the modern. He invented the modern scientific method, and even that's kind of unfair. I think you should really give credit to a lot of people. It was a bunch of different philosophers who developed the modern scientific method. It was people like Francis Bacon, Galileo, even Descartes to a certain extent. Some of these British empiricists. So there's a lot of people that deserve credit for it. But I think Galileo more, because he would do experiments like the one I just mentioned, where he's dropping an apple and a feather from the top of the tower to try to get him to fall at the same speed. He couldn't do it because it wouldn't work. He draped a big canvas over the tower so that the wind wouldn't interfere with the objects, because modern physicists, Newtonian physics tells us that he's right, that actually, yes, objects do fall at the same rate of speed in a vacuum. If there's no wind, there's no turbulence, there's no barometric pressure, and there's no such thing as a vacuum here on Earth. You're not going to find it. And so he tried to make it as much of, as little wind interference as possible. He got the apple and the feather to sort of fall at the same speed or close enough to satisfy him. But he was ridiculed for that. He wasn't taken very seriously during his own lifetime. And he put his career on the line and kind of suffered for it. Unlike Copernicus and Kepler, these guys sort of waited until they were almost dead, and I think even Kepler was already dead when his book was published. I could be wrong about that, but regardless, they waited till they were past their prime years and close to death's door. But Galileo, he was close to middle age. He was like early 40s, late 30s or something, and published these dialogues that were in defense of this Copernican model of the universe, and he got in a lot of trouble for it. What he's also known for, though, is inventing the telescope. That's the one I was hoping.
That too. And I heard he also did and the thermometer, right?
Yeah, I mean that's
Look, yeah, those was always stuck with me. Galileo, that he invented that. Okay,
right. To be honest, though, I don't really even think he deserves credit for the telescope. I think he was the first to actually patent it, so he legally, like, owned the rights. But I think there were telescopes before Galileo. He made it way better though. He improved the ability its abilities by like 16 or 20 fold or something like that. So he made the first telescope that was really worth a damn, I guess, right? Um, but yeah, people will always, he's the inventor of the telescope. He invented or developed the modern scientific method, and yeah, he definitely deserves a lot of credit for that. But what did he see when he looked through his telescope? He was expecting to see these smooth, perfect planets, and the moon was supposed to be like this smooth, divine, beautiful, like crystal orb in the sky. But he looks at the moon's surface and he's like, it looks like a desert up there. It's like barren. It's not pretty. And so he was sort of skeptical. And then, he starts to embrace the Copernican model, and starts to read Kepler, and he starts to defend this stuff, but he gets in a lot of trouble for it, right? The church, uh, you know, was very powerful in those days, and they didn't like what he was saying, and so they made him, go on trial before the Roman Inquisition, and they demanded that he retract his views. And he was even for a while, for centuries, I think until like 1960 something, the Catholic Church had excommunicated him. Um, what does that mean to be excommunicated? Well, you're kicked out of the church, but even more importantly, you're kicked out of the eternal reward afterlife. You've got to go to suffer in eternal damnation for ever. Well, that's kind of redundant, eternally forever. But you know what I mean. So Aristotle is doomed. Why? Why was the church so angry with him? Do you think? Why was Copernicus and Kepler hesitant to publish their views? So what? The sun's in the center. So what? The planets aren't perfect. They don't move in perfect circles. They change their speed. Why was the church trying to shut all these people up? Why did the church not want anybody to teach about this stuff? Why is this such a big deal?
I think it's because like the church is like very religious, so like all that scientific mumbo jumbo that anybody tries to spit game to them, they not trying to hear that. They was like, oh, we all come from one God, we should bless him and all that stuff. And and then they bump head with like the scientists and all that stuff. Cause they was like, the scientists was like, oh yeah, we uh evolutionized from like monkeys and stuff like that, or we're created from gas and chemicals. We just made up a lot of stuff because of the Big Bang Theory. It tastes like that, but
Right. Well, I can see why you'd say that, but don't forget, evolution comes much later. Like
yeah,
Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, these guys are 1500s, early 1600s, and so, but I can see why you'd say that because a lot of religious institutions today feel like they're antagonistic towards scientists, but up until this point that wasn't the perception. Most what we would call scientists today were usually doing their science under the umbrella of the church. And so science and religion were not really separate. And so for centuries, you had people like St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. They were taking all these philosophers and the word scientist is really kind of a newer word. It's really not until you get the modern scientific method that you get this term scientist. But before that, it was all philosophers, but they called them natural philosophers or philosophers of nature if they studied the natural world. But people like Aquinas, particularly, they didn't really see a conflict between science and religion. And they had kind of worked out a system that made their Christian faith and science fit together. But I think you're right, because what's happening, this is sort of the beginning of the rift between science and religion. And I think your response, even though, like some of the stuff you said is a little bit more recent, it's still kind of, this is the beginning of what you're talking about. This is sort of where it starts. And the church, I think, is threatened by, what you're calling science mumbo jumbo. They wouldn't have thought of it that way back then. They embraced science until it started to contradict what they had been teaching for hundreds of years. And so the church had developed a lot of power in Europe over the medieval period. They weren't that powerful at the beginning. An early Christian church were outcasts, in the early Roman Empire. But by the time you get to Copernicus and Kepler, the church is probably more powerful than most of the royalty, really. You had a bunch of like wars and fighting in Europe, and so you'd have one monarch killing another, and the peasants didn't know who to worship. They didn't know they knew to worship God, though. They knew that the church was there. So sometimes they'd be following this king, and then there'd be another king, but their loyalty to the church, that was the one constant thing, the one sort of source of stability and answers, and it gave them a sense of a higher purpose. Earth is in the center. God created us, and we're in the middle. And so what we do here on earth is important. And we're, if we're a good person, we're going to go to this afterlife. And a lot of the things that the church taught made pretty good sense. It kind of doesn't seem like the earth is moving. You're telling me that the earth is spinning? Doesn't feel like it. So some of these new ideas didn't really make sense, and some of the old ones worked, and they fit with the religion really well. And so the church, again, they had a lot of political authority at this time, and they also, were starting to be challenged by these guys, and so they wanted to shut them up. And it's not just these more, I guess, what you might call scientifically minded thinkers, but the church was even being challenged by more spiritual thinkers, by people who were more concerned not with what the church was teaching about the stars and about the planets, but what the church was teaching about other things. Does anybody have any idea what I'm referring to? There's one person I want to talk about. There were more people that were doing this, but there's one man in particular who I'm kind of alluding to, who stood up to the church for different reasons, because he was concerned that they were teaching the wrong teachings about the Bible and what Christianity truly was. No one knows who. Maybe I'll give you another hint. He went up to the church one
I
morning.
know who you're talking about. I just can't think of his name.
No one else? No one else? He went up to the church one morning and nailed a bunch of complaints on the door of the church. And then he got in trouble. He got excommunicated too. Martin Luther. No, nobody? Jeez. Man, they really, I'm telling you, I don't know what they're teaching you guys in school these days. I can see, though, man, school was really, really bad when I went. Public school was horrible. And I mean, I grew up in an okay neighborhood. It wasn't like a really super rich neighborhood. It wasn't super, super poor. Some of my friends were really, really poor. A couple of them were actually pretty well off. So it was like a decent school, but it was bad. Like, they were not that good. It wasn't that good. I think schools have gotten even worse. But it's to me, it's a shame that people don't know who Martin Luther was. They don't know who Copernicus was. I mean, these are pretty important people. I mean, you should know this stuff. Yeah, Dylan, you had a comment?
Yeah, I knew who Martin Luther was, but I didn't know him in
You couldn't
detail.
remember
Like,
the name?
yeah, because I remember I took a fine arts class in college, like 2 semesters ago. I kind of got familiar with him. I know we figured out Martin Luther King named after him. So
Right,
man,
yeah. That's
yeah.
another reason I'm like, you should know Martin Luther. I mean, heck, Martin Luther King, everybody knows Martin Luther King Jr., so you'd think you'd know what he was named after. And Martin Luther is he's not a perfect human being, right? I mean, the guy there's a lot of things not to like about him. He was pretty anti-Semitic, and he was extremely anti-Semitic. But I think he revolutionized the way that people thought about religion, particularly the Christian faith, he wrote, and really honestly, I think even though he was a Christian, I think that Luther's approach to faith has had a big influence on the way that people approach other faiths, whether they're Christian or not. And I think even the way we approach politics, I don't know if I want to get into that, but you know, what was Luther's story though? Do you remember some of the problems he had with the church? What were some of the things he didn't like about the church's teachings? What were they saying that he thought was wrong about the church? Nobody
Oh,
knows.
I don't remember.
Um, the one thing that's the most famous. I mean, there's a list of 95 like things that he doesn't like. But the one that I guess people talk about the most is the practice of indulgences. No one knows what indulgences are. They're not around anymore.
Like money, someone money,
Kind of, yeah. But what's the money for?
like
You pay the,
to help build.
no, no, no. Well, the church.
Uh,
Okay, so the church would take money from you for what?
the collection plate.
Well, that they still do that today.
Oh, they okay.
Yeah, this they don't do this anymore. They would take money from people to forgive you of your sins. So, like, you basically buy your way into heaven was kind of the idea, you know. The church they would go around asking people, what have you done? Have you been a sinner? Oh, that's bad. You got to pay 50 gold pieces for that. And you'd buy your way into heaven basically. And they would even do stuff like if you had a relative or a friend that died, they'd go talk to you and be like, hey, sorry to hear about your loss. But you know what? We heard that person was sinning on the day they died, and they never went and paid for their soul to be cleansed. So they're going to be in purgatory for a long time, waiting to get clean enough to get into heaven. Oh, but you know what? If you're a good friend or a good cousin or nephew or whatever, you know, you'll pay, and we'll talk to God for you, and we'll get them into heaven, you know, much sooner if you pay us some gold. So, you know, Luther didn't like that. Luther, he was given this post in Württemberg, this German town, at this seminary school. So he was supposed to teach the Bible to all these students who wanted to become priests. And he took that post very seriously. In fact, he didn't think he was worthy of it. There's a story that when he was offered the job, he said he would die. It was like too overwhelming. I'm not worthy of it. I'll die trying. And the guy that was offering the job said, you'll die trying? Oh, well, then you'll get to your Lord quicker. Here's the job, you know? And so, but he didn't think he was worthy of it. So he sat down and apparently he read the Bible, you know, cover to cover, you know, every word in the original Greek and Hebrew and all that. And he was shocked. He was shocked because he felt like there were things in the book that contradicted what the church was teaching. And one of the more controversial things, this is what they'll, you know, if you go to your history teacher and they're going to cover Martin Luther, they're probably certainly going to mention indulgences, right? Paying your way into heaven. But there were other practices too that I think were pretty significant, maybe even more so. This is the one that's kind of the more salacious, like, oh, wow, that's kind of sleazy, like guilting people into paying money for the church. Like, yeah, that's kind of weird. But also, what about the book itself, the Bible? Let's say you wanted to read the Bible. You know, you went to church one day and you listened to mass and you listened to the sermon portion, and you know the pastor, the priest was you know quoting from some passage from the Gospel of John, or you know Paul's letter to the Galatians or something, and you know you thought it was just a deep and beautiful passage. So you go up to the priest after church and you say, that was a really beautiful passage. I'd like to read the full version. Could I get a copy of the Gospel of John in the church bookstore? Were you allowed to do that? Could you go buy a copy of the Bible and read it yourself? You just felt like it? What do you think? Yes, no, maybe so? You weren't allowed to read it. Why not? Why can't I read it? If it's full of truth and goodness, I want to read it. If it's the most beautiful, best story ever told, I want. Why did the church not let the common people read the book? Why did you have to study at seminary and become a priest and all that? Why? What was their justification? Anybody have any guesses what they were telling people as to why they weren't allowed to read it? I mean, most of you are probably thinking they were just doing that to like be corrupt, and they were just doing that. That's kind of what Luther was thinking. But what was their justification? What do you think they were, telling people that were curious? Anybody ever read that book? You ever read the Bible? Anybody ever read the Bible?
I know some stories, but I never actually sat
Oh, you
down.
never read it? Oh, geez. Okay.
Yeah, I know some stories. I just never.
Man, I guess I'm assuming a lot more knowledge about some of this stuff than I should. Okay, well, yeah, like I've read the book a few times, and there's some passages that are pretty straightforward, that are pretty clear, but there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of hard to follow, and sometimes it's not that it's hard to follow, but that it can be interpreted in many different ways. It's not clear what the meaning is. It could mean this or it could mean that. I mean, that's true of any book. But why is that a danger when it comes to the holy book? What happens if you read it and you misinterpret it? The argument that the church was making was that you might read it and you might read it the wrong way, and you might misinterpret it. And so you'll have the wrong belief, and you'll go to hell because God doesn't want someone who has the wrong belief. So that was the justification. It's for your own good that you're not allowed to read it. If you did read it, though, what language did you read it in? You read it in Latin, which was not the original language it was written in. Latin was sort of the scholarly language. It was the language of philosophers and smart people. It was what people across Europe and the Roman Empire, they could all write in Latin. So even if they were talking to somebody across the world, or across the Western world, they could write in Latin and understand each other. And so the scholars, when the church was young, in the early days of the church, the scholars sat down to translate the original Bible into Latin. And when they did, the church claimed, and they still believe today, as far as I know, the Catholic Church, still believes that Latin translation is the miracle translation, because back then they didn't have a printing press. This was like, I think, 2nd century when Jerome sat down to translate the Latin Vulgate. It might have been 3rd century. But apparently they had like 40, 50, 70 scribes. I can't remember the number. But all these scribes were just sitting down translating the Bible all at the same time, from cover to cover. And when they were done, they compared each other's different translations from the Greek and the Hebrew to the Latin. And apparently every translation was exactly the same. And so the church argued that was proof that this version was even more accurate than the original. This was the version that was guided by the Holy Spirit. So the Latin Vulgate was the name of this version. You had to read it in Latin. The church services had to be in Latin. You couldn't translate the Bible to German, which is what Luther eventually did. Luther thought that everyone should be able to read the Bible. Luther didn't like the hierarchy in the church, the idea that the Pope was the highest right under God, and the bishops and the cardinals and all that. He didn't like that. He thought that wasn't in the Bible, and he thought that Christianity was more about community, setting up small churches, small parishes to serve the community, and that it was actually important for us to have a personal relation with the higher power, with God. Unlike the church, which was teaching us that no, it's a universal. The word Catholic literally means universal. It's a universal program. The church has the answers. Follow our prescription, and, come to us if you have any issues. We will be the middleman between you and the divine being. And so you weren't even really supposed to pray in the early church. The priest would do all the praying for you. You had to be trained to be able to speak to God. But again, Luther, he's got this more like personal, individual, relationship that each one of us has to sort of establish with the divine. And so, one morning he wakes up, the famous story, and he nails the 95 Theses to the door in Württemberg, and he gets kicked out of the church, and he starts the Protestant Revolution, along with many others. You have people like John Calvin, who comes much later, but all these different denominations of Christianity that are much more popular, I suppose, in the United States now, but also in Northern Europe and other parts of the world. This all sort of begins with Martin Luther. So not only do you have, during the 1500s, the 1600s, not only do you have these more scientifically minded individuals who are challenging the authority of the church, but you even have individuals like Martin Luther who are challenging the church from a more spiritual perspective, not really thinking about the natural world and the universe and the stars, but just thinking about his own salvation and his own relationship to what he considers a higher power, God, the Christian God. And so this is what I think gives birth to, what Dylan refers to as the Enlightenment, and not him. I mean, he didn't invent that term. That's what the historians call it, like the Age of Enlightenment. This gives birth to Enlightenment philosophy, to modern philosophy, to the modern scientific method. And Descartes is one of these figures who fits into this picture. But I think now we can kind of see, perhaps, maybe, why there's a shift in modern philosophy away from metaphysics. When you were looking at people like Plato and Aristotle, first philosophy for them is metaphysics, the theories about reality, the universe. You start with the way things are, the nature of being, how is the universe, and then you can apply it to specifics. Then you can apply it to how do you come to know these things. If all the things that are the forms, like for Plato, then once we establish that all truth is the form, knowledge is not knowing the forms. Once we know that, for Aristotle, that the universe consists of substances, individual beings that are aiming for a telos, some goal, some aim, some purpose that they're aiming to fulfill. Once we understand the metaphysics, then we can understand the knowledge part. How do we come to know them? Well, we have to know their aim. We have to know their end goal. We have to know what fulfills them, and then we can study the animals. Then we can study biological creatures. Then we can study ethics. So metaphysics is first. All the other theories come next. But the modern philosophers don't think we can do it that way. We have to start with epistemology. We have to start with a theory of knowledge. Given all that I've just said, all the things we just covered, all the historical things, the scientific revolution, Martin Luther revolting against the church, can you now kind of see why there's a shift in focus? Why is there a focus away from metaphysics to epistemology, theories of knowledge? Why the big move, do you think, in Descartes? Anybody got a clue? For Descartes, the big question is, what is knowledge? How do you have knowledge? How do you know what you know? What is the basis for your knowledge? Why would those be such pivotal, important questions? The first questions that you want to ask before you ask any other questions. Why would he think that given the time period he's living in? Well, let's think about this. You have to also keep in mind that Descartes was a very well-educated man. He went to some of the finest schools, learned some of the most advanced science, what they thought of as science back then. And then he lives through all this. He learns all this stuff, and then he finds out that it's not even true. And it all seemed so true, right? All this, it seemed like the Earth's not moving. It doesn't feel like it's moving. Don't you think we would feel it spinning? Wouldn't we like be having to hang on to it constantly to not spin off of it? And it's moving around the sun? That's just crazy. Who thinks that? That it just didn't. It wasn't intuitive, but it was true. Turned out to be true. So I guess you can kind of see where the skepticism comes in, where this hesitancy comes in. Imagine you go to study some medical field. You want to be a doctor. So you spend all the years studying, you get into medical school, you become some sort of surgeon, let's say. And you work your ass off. It's pain in the ass. You got to do your internship and, what do they call it? Your residency. You stress yourself out. And let's say you're almost done with everything. You're finishing up your residency. You got your MD. You're ready to get into your practice. You're ready to practice your craft. You're a surgeon, let's say, of some sort. And let's say that, the day before you're about to start your practice, somebody discovers something about the way that surgery's done, and so they find out that it actually doesn't work, and that they have to completely change it. And there's a new way to do it that's better, that avoids all the problems of the old way, right? Let's say, just to keep it simple, you're a heart surgeon. They find out that all the way they've done heart surgery before is very risky. There's, a certain percentage of failure. They've got a new method that is just as hard to learn. It's completely different. You've got to go all the way back to medical school and start over from scratch again, and start over. Your MD is null and void. Maybe that's not the perfect example, right? But try to imagine a scenario like that, where you really, and let's just say also, let's make it even worse. It's your life's dream. You really want to do this. It's something you feel like you're meant to do. You're not just doing it for the money. You're not just doing it because your parents will be proud of you. You're doing it because you actually are interested in the subject matter. You want to be really good at it. You want to be the best at it. You think you could be really, success, and it'll bring your life fulfillment. You'd be really bummed out if this happened to you. If you were just on the edge of, the next day you're about to start your practice, and then the whole field gets destroyed and they replace it with a new method that you've got to go back to this drawing board and start over again. That's pretty much where Descartes was. So I think, it's hard to wrap your head around why Descartes takes his skepticism. You're going to see this when we get to the first meditation. Why does he take his skepticism so far? Why does Descartes take his skepticism so far? You got to understand, things that smart people, Aristotle was not an idiot. Plato was not an idiot. These guys were smart, but they were wrong. And they were basing these truths, what they thought were truths, on some pretty intuitive propositions, stuff that just kind of made sense. And so, Descartes' like, look, these guys were smart and they were wrong. I would like to be, let's go back to the example. I'd like to be a heart surgeon. I think it's my calling, but I'm kind of hesitant to start medical school again. I kind of gonna wait and see. Why would I be hesitant? Well, who's to say that another guy's going to come along with an even better way to do it, and then that the new method's going to be replaced? So Descartes wants to be a good philosopher. He wants to study the natural world. He wants to understand physics, mathematics, geometry, all this wealth of knowledge. He wants to know all this stuff. He's willing to go back to school, start over. But he doesn't want to learn another false method. He doesn't want to accumulate. Imagine all the time and effort poor Ptolemy and all these other astronomers put into that Ptolemaic model, making all these assumptions: Earth's in the middle, perfect circles, circles within circles, Imagine how many observations, how many nights they were looking at the sky, measuring things, doing math problems, calculations, changing things up, tinkering their theories just to make it work. And then now we look at their diagrams and we kind of chuckle. Ha ha, how cute. That's what they thought back then. Descartes does not want that to happen to him. So he's very cautious. Now I guess you can see, perhaps, I hope, I made my point, why the shift away from metaphysics, away from how things are. And before we start talking about the nature of the universe and the fundamental nature of reality, let's talk about how do we even know anything? What is the basis for any knowledge claims? How do we know that something is certain? How can we know something for sure? Is it even possible to know anything for sure? Descartes wants to answer those questions before he peers his eyes out into the world and tries to explain things and give us an account of things. And so I think too, like, Dylan, this kind of goes back to your comment at the very beginning. This is kind of the beginning of a more observational approach. Although you're going to see with Descartes, he's going to turn out to be, in a way, even though he's trying to move on from these older philosophers, you're going to see that Descartes, in a way, is a bit akin to Plato. Descartes is very suspicious of what he sees. He's very suspicious of the senses. He thinks that, in a way, part of the problem with the old approach was that we were too trusting of our senses. Doesn't feel like the earth is moving, doesn't feel like the earth is flying through the sky around the sun, so it must not be. So the senses were tricking us. It's reason, it's rationality that's going to set us straight. So we're almost out of time, so I need to maybe wrap things up a little bit. But just to preview, we didn't get to the reading today. Let's look where we're going. On Tuesday, I guess I thought thought we had spring break. I guess on Tuesday at 11, I'll be recording a lecture on the first meditation, and probably we'll get into the second meditation as well. But let's just briefly, before I let you go, this will probably just take about 5 minutes. Let's look at some of these approaches to the problems I've just posed, that we've talked about. What are some of the approaches that we're going to see during the modern period in philosophy? Now, Descartes, his approach, where he's saying, look, I think the big problem is we've been relying too much on our senses. We base it on Aristotle. He was this guy that observed and looked at creatures and like dissected them, and he saw these aims and assumed that everything was goal oriented, and that was unfounded, and so observation leads to all sorts of speculation and problems. So Descartes, his approach is what you would call a more rationalist approach. So during the modern period, there are these two schools of thought that develop. Descartes represents, I guess you could say, the rationalist school of thought. But you've got other philosophers, people like, let me see here, I'll be right under people like John Locke, for instance. And there are others, but people like John Locke, David Hume, things like that. They took a more empirical approach. Now, what's the difference? These two schools of thought are basically two different theories of knowledge. Descartes, again, he's more like, look, the senses are deceptive. The senses tell us stuff, but the stuff that it tells us is confused, and it needs to be improved by reason. So the basic theory of rationalism is the idea that knowledge is based on reason. Knowledge is based on our ability to understand concepts and to apply those concepts. That's where our knowledge is based. So rationalism is an epistemology. It's a theory of knowledge. The competing view, which we'll talk a little bit about later on once we get through more Descartes, but the other school of thought was the empiricists, right? The school of empiricism. People like John Locke said, no, actually knowledge is not based on reason. Reason plays a role, But our knowledge of things always starts with our experience. We have knowledge of things like circles because we've seen circular things. We have knowledge of the color blue because we've seen the color blue. And we've been taught to associate the word blue with the experience. So the rationalists like Descartes are going to say knowledge is based on reason. The empiricists are going to say it's based on experience. Knowledge is always based on experience. It starts in experience, and then we build upon that. So those are the two competing schools of thought. And then we'll get to people like Kant, and I might have a little bit of time once we wrap up Descartes. We might talk a little bit about Kant. Kant was a pretty important figure. Maybe I should go ahead and write his last name up here as well. Kant, in a way, you could say he synthesizes the two views. He's not really a rationalist or an empiricist, but he sort of takes both views and sort of puts them together. You know, you need reason and experience to have knowledge. That the synthesis of the two, not one is primary. That they're both equally important. So anyway, we've only got like 3 or 4 minutes left, and that's a really good place to stop. Man, you really bummed me out, Dylan. Sorry, I'm not going to hold it against you, but I thought I had spring break here at TSU. But I guess I don't, so no big deal. I'll have it at other places, so it'll be a pretty light week for me next week. I'll be able to catch up on grading still. So, and I wasn't planning on going out of town or anything, so that's not going to damper my plans. But I'm glad you said something, though. I'm really glad you told me, because I probably would have totally just not shown up. And that's not good, because we're already behind, and we need to go ahead and push forward. So I need to check my calendar and make sure I redo the schedule for that Thursday that we are off. But anyways, I'm going to stop recording. Next time we'll get into the meditation, the first meditation and the second meditation. Let me hit stop.